Welcome to ExtraFrame, the podcast by the global photography community. This is a podcast where we go a little deeper than just the photographs themselves. In each episode, we explore the stories behind some of the most important photographers in history, how they started, what shaped their work, and why their images still matter today. For our very first episode, we're starting with one of the most legendary photographers of all time, Ansel Adams. If you've ever seen a dramatic black and white photograph of Yosemite, towering granite cliffs rising out of the mist, or a quiet landscape with a glowing moon hanging over a small town, there's a very good chance you were looking at an Ansel Adams photograph. But Adams wasn't just a landscape photographer. He was also a technical innovator, a teacher, an environmentalist, and one of the most influential figures photography has ever had. Today, we're going to walk through his entire story, from his early life in California to how he discovered photography, the techniques he helped develop, the cameras he used, and why his work continues to influence photographers more than a century later. So, let's start at the beginning. Ansel Adams was born on February 20th, 1902, in San Francisco, California. He grew up in a fairly comfortable household. His father was a businessman who ran a small company that dealt in lumber and insurance, and his mother came from a wealthy California family. But Adams' childhood wasn't exactly typical. He had trouble fitting into traditional schools and often struggled with the structure of classroom learning. He was curious, energetic, and sometimes restless, which made school difficult for him. Eventually, his parents decided to homeschool him, and that turned out to be incredibly important. Being educated at home gave Adams a lot more freedom. Instead of sitting in classrooms all day, he spent a lot of time outdoors, especially along the coastline near San Francisco. Those early experiences in nature would end up shaping his entire life. Interestingly, though, photography wasn't his first artistic passion. Music was. As a teenager, Adams became deeply committed to playing the piano. He practiced for hours every day and seriously considered becoming a professional concert pianist. For a long time, music was the center of his life. Photography actually entered the picture almost by accident. In 1916, when Adams was 14 years old, his parents took him on a family trip to Yosemite National Park. And that trip completely changed the direction of his life. During the visit, Adams was given a simple Kodak Brownie box camera. The Brownie was a very basic camera, fixed lens, minimal controls, nothing fancy at all. But for Adams, it was enough to spark something. He started photographing everything around him in Yosemite: the waterfalls, the forests, the massive granite cliffs, and the incredible light moving through the valley. Something about the place connected with him immediately. He kept returning to Yosemite over the years, and it slowly became both his creative playground and a place that felt almost spiritual to him. Through his late teens and early 20s, Adams found himself balancing two passions. During the winter, he focused on music, studying piano and practicing intensely. During the summer, he often spent time in Yosemite, working, hiking, and photographing the landscape. It was during these trips that Adams began meeting other artists and photographers who were interested in capturing the American wilderness. One of the most important influences during this time was the Sierra Club. The Sierra Club was, and still is, a major environmental organization focused on protecting wilderness areas in the United States. Adams joined their summer expeditions into the Sierra Nevada mountains and often served as the group's photographer. These trips gave him endless opportunities to explore and photograph untouched landscapes. But they also shaped his philosophy. For Adams, photography wasn't just about making beautiful images. It was about showing people why nature was worth protecting. Over time, Adams realized that photography was becoming more than just a hobby. It was becoming the thing he cared about most. In the early 1930s, he made the difficult decision to step away from pursuing music professionally and commit fully to photography. And that's when things really started to change. Around this time, Adams began developing the techniques that would eventually make him famous. One of the most important ideas he helped develop was something called the zone system. The zone system was created by Adams and fellow photographer Fred Archer, and it completely changed the way photographers approached exposure. The basic idea was to divide the range of tones in a photograph, from deep black shadows to bright white highlights, into a series of zones. By carefully measuring the light and deciding exactly where certain tones should fall within those zones, photographers could control how the final image would look. This gave Adams an incredible amount of control over his photographs. It allowed him to create black and white images with incredibly rich tonal detail, deep shadows, glowing highlights, and smooth transitions between them. But Adams always emphasized something important. Capturing the negative was only half the process. He famously said, "The negative is the score, and the print is the performance." What he meant was that the real artistry often happened in the darkroom. When Adams printed his photographs, he carefully adjusted contrast, brightness, and tonal balance to bring out the full potential of the image. The result was a level of craftsmanship that few photographers had achieved before. Now, let's talk about the equipment he used. Adams worked during a time when cameras were large, heavy, and very slow to operate. His main tools were large-format view cameras. One of his most well-known cameras was an 8 by 10-inch view camera, which used individual sheets of film. Using one of these cameras was a very deliberate process. The camera had to be mounted on a tripod. The image was composed on a ground glass screen, and the photographer had to carefully adjust the lens and movements of the camera before making the exposure. It was nothing like modern digital photography, but the results were incredible. Large-format film captured an enormous amount of detail, which allowed Adams to produce large prints with stunning clarity. He also used lenses from companies like Cooke and Zeiss, and later in his career he worked with Hasselblad medium-format cameras as newer technology became available. Even with all that heavy gear, Adams was known for hiking deep into the wilderness to photograph the landscapes he loved. And some of those photographs became some of the most famous images in the history of photography. One of his most legendary photographs is Moonrise, Hernandez, New Mexico. The story behind that image is almost as famous as the photograph itself. In 1941, Adams was driving through the small town of Hernandez when he suddenly saw the moon rising above the distant mountains. The last light of the sun was illuminating white crosses in a cemetery below. He immediately pulled the car over and rushed to set up his camera. But there was a problem. He couldn't find his light meter. So Adams had to estimate the exposure from memory, thinking about the brightness of the moon and applying what he knew about the zone system. He managed to capture the image just seconds before the sunlight faded. That photograph went on to become one of the most famous landscape images ever made. But Adams's influence went far beyond individual photographs. In the early 1930s, he became part of a group called Group F64, alongside photographers like Edward Weston and Imogen Cunningham. The name comes from a very small aperture setting, f64, which produces extremely sharp images with deep depth of field. The photographers in this group believed in what they called pure photography. They rejected the soft, painterly style that earlier photographers had used and instead focused on sharp detail, clarity, and the natural qualities of the photographic image. Their work helped push photography toward being taken seriously as a fine art. Adams was also a dedicated teacher. Over the years, he taught countless workshops and lectures, sharing his technical knowledge with younger photographers. He also wrote several books that became incredibly influential, including The Camera, The Negative, and The Print. Even today, photographers who want to understand film photography often study those books. But Adams's life wasn't only about photography. He was deeply committed to environmental conservation. His photographs of Yosemite and the American West helped people see the beauty of these landscapes in a new way. And in several cases, his images helped support efforts to protect these places. One famous example involved Kings Canyon. Adams presented a portfolio of photographs to members of the US government to show the importance of preserving the area. Those images played a role in the creation of Kings Canyon National Park. By the later years of his life, Adams had become something of a legend. He received numerous awards and honors, including the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 1980, one of the highest civilian honors in the United States. Even with all that recognition, Adams stayed deeply involved in photography, conservation, and education. He continued printing photographs and teaching workshops well into his later years. Ansel Adams passed away on April 22, 1984, but his legacy never really faded. Today, his photographs remain some of the most recognizable images in the history of photography. His technical ideas changed how photographers understand exposure and printing. His environmental work helped protect some of the most beautiful landscapes in North America. And maybe most importantly, Adams helped people see the natural world differently. Through his photographs, mountains, forests, and rivers weren't just scenery. They became something powerful, something worth protecting. And that idea still resonates with photographers and nature lovers all over the world. As we wrap up this first episode of ExtraFrame, it feels fitting that we started with Ansel Adams. Because in many ways, Adams represents what photography can be at its very best. A mix of art, science, patience, and passion. A way of translating the world into something lasting. And a reminder that sometimes the most powerful images come from simply slowing down and truly seeing what's in front of you. Thanks for listening to the very first episode of ExtraFrame by the global photography community. In future episodes, we'll explore the lives and work of many more photographers, from early pioneers to modern voices shaping photography today. Until next time, keep looking for the moments worth capturing. And remember, sometimes the extra frame is where the real story begins.